The great prayers of the Old Testament and what we learn from them. It's so important that we go to these great figures of the Old Testament because we draw so much inspiration, comfort, and strength from them in terms of our own life and dedication to prayer. These Old Testament figures have their blind spots and weak spots, their experiences of tragedy, crosses, and weakness, and yet God uses them as humble and weak instruments to lead God's people. They give us so much strength. So let's take a brief look at some of the great prayers of the Old Testament. Think of Abraham, who in his covenant with God became a great intercessor for his people. He exemplifies for us that beautiful sense and harmony with God's divine mercy, that compassion of God, that fidelity to God, and that obedience to God seen in his willingness with his son Isaac to bring him to the altar of sacrifice. And yet that beautiful story of the lamb who was brought instead. But that beautiful modeling and foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, his beautiful harmony and courageous sacrifice on the cross on behalf of our redemption and all of humanity. Think too of Noah in the flood and just the calamity in human history and Noah's beautiful sense of fidelity to God and his upright heart. Think of Moses. Think of the burning bush, which is a symbol of the kind of burning heart and complete dedication that you and I are called to have in prayer. That beautiful image of Moses leaving the mountain and his face dazzling and radiant with God. That's what prayer does for you and I. When we go from a superficial level of prayer to a deep level of prayer, our beings, our faces radiate God's peace and love in all sorts of unconscious and natural ways to people. Then we think of the great figure of David. David, who had committed such a tragic sin in his life, which was so evil, and yet the beautiful spirit of repentance that leads him to union with God. And then his incredible theological and human depth expressed in the beautiful Psalms. The Psalms are a masterpiece of Old Testament prayer, and they're linked to the life of David so beautifully. We see the great figure of Elijah, who experiences the weariness and disillusionments of life. There are times in his life as God's servant where he literally wants to die and call it quits. And yet we see so beautifully how the Lord comes to him precisely in those moments of disillusionment, in precisely in those moments of life's greatest discouragements, and comes and brings him the strength he needs to be a courageous and upright servant of God. All of these great Old Testament prayers, they, in a certain sense, they show us and foreshadow for us the figure of Jesus Christ. They're all looking and anticipating the figure of Jesus, the master of all prayer. Let's study the lives of these great Old Testament prayers. Let's live their spirit and have that deep, burning bush intimacy with the Lord.